All right, we're back for real this time on the podcast today with Jankin as well as Neil Perry or Nathaniel Perry, I guess. You doing Nathaniel Perry for the fans, Neil Perry for the friends? Is that right?
There we go. That works. Yeah.
Okay, got it. If you know him, you can say that. Yeah, Neil has been a teacher of mine in undergrad and a friend now, writes great poetry in rural Virginia. I think writes mostly about rural Virginia. Um, and yeah, it has been, I guess, like an interesting perspective as I continue to go on in the writing thing because it seems like you're kind of doing the exact opposite of, and I guess you had your like big city moments, but you're pretty dedicated to the country life at this point.
Well, I guess I've kind of got stuck here. So
Yeah.
let's make the best of it, I think.
Right. You're in, well, I guess is it technically Farmville or is it
Uh,
county land?
no, yeah, I mean, our mailing address is Farmville, but we're in Cumberland County.
Okay. Cumberland, Canada. Also, another great artist out of Cumberland County besides Neil is that guy, the ginger rich man from Richmond, viral guitar kid.
Oh.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's Neil's neighbor.
No, I've, I think he's from the county south of here, to be honest.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Man, yeah, when that happened, I was like, no way that guy's from Farmville. That's awesome.
Like,
It made a lot of sense though. I was like, I probably like that does seem to be like the type of guy that would be hanging out at cookout. Yeah.
I think he had a big show at the press club after all that happened.
Did he really?
Yeah.
That's awesome. So Neil is also a dedicated, I guess, student of another incredibly rural and very like I don't know, not so known or appreciated, certainly not appreciated enough poet, George Scarborough. And yeah, I wanted to have Neil on to kind of talk about Scarborough and I guess as it relates to his own life or your own life, and also just to spread the word about Scarborough a little bit, I think is one of the great, I guess, what as you said, one of the great 20th century poets that no one knows about.
Yeah. That's how I would put it.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess give us a little background about who George Scarborough is, and also I guess how you first came across Scarborough, because it's
Sure.
his works are hard to find these days.
They are. Right. So Scarborough was born in 1915, I think, in rural Tennessee, somewhere in the Oak Ridge area. I think the town he was born in was maybe called Patty, Tennessee. But his family was a very poor family of parent. His father was a sharecropper. And so they moved all around. They were constantly losing their house and having to move to a new sharecropping situation. And he writes about this in his poems and in his one book of very autobiographical prose about how his father would constantly lose their homes because of the way the sharecropping in Appalachia worked. I don't know if you know anything about it, but it's basically like being an indentured servant. And so anyway, and he had six older siblings. He was the youngest of seven. And he was very devoted to his mother, had a kind of mixed relationship with his father. And he writes about that as well. But anyhow, so he is born there in rural Tennessee and spent, honestly, the vast majority of his life in that area. In his first book, Tellico Blue,
Okay.
many of the poems are written about that particular local area that he will sometimes call Eastonall, which is a reference to the mountain, a spur of the Appalachian Mountains that runs through there. And many of his poems are about his neighbors, friends, family members from that area. So in that way, he's positioning himself obviously as an inheritor of some of what Robert Frost was doing in that same time period. Frost was born in the 1870s, so is a generation or two older than Scarborough, but Frost would have been famous by the time Scarborough was reading, and so he's an obvious influence on what Scarborough is doing. But not just Frost, also Edwin Arlington Robinson would have been a crucial influence on early Scarborough as well. And later, even somebody like Seamus Heaney was a very important influence on what Scarborough was doing. What I find attractive about his poetry is that it's almost undescribable. It is generally written in form, in meter and rhyme, but it is also immediately apparent that it's rather experimental in both diction, in approach to subject matter, even in imagery. So and this is what the poet Forrest Gander was a big supporter of Scarborough's, and that's probably where I first ran across the name. And Gander, of course, and his wife C.D. Wright were both experimental poets, and they both saw in Scarbrough something just wildly original. And so for me, as somebody who also writes in meter and rhyme, but I do not consider my poetry to be conservative or formal in some sort of capital F way. I find Scarbrough to be a real, honestly, guiding light in how to be relentlessly experimental with poetry, but also working with older tools like meter and rhyme. I first read Scarbrough. I picked up a copy of his selected poems, which was published in the late '70s by Iris Press, which is located in Oak Ridge or in Knoxville area. And I bought it in Chicago, and I read it when I got back to my little house in Bloomington, Indiana, and I was immediately hooked by the voice in the poems, which is like I was just saying, at once wildly experimental, deeply connected to the land and the landscape, and in general thinking about things that most writers in the 1940s were not thinking or writing about. I found him to be a voice that felt at once old and at once contemporary, and always bringing something new to the table. And across his long career, he was always continued to experiment. I mean, his last book, which was called Under the Lemon Tree and was published in the early 2000s, were poems all written, free verse poems, all written in the voice of Han Shan, the 9th century Chinese poet, who was also known as Cold Mountain. And so Scarborough's influences and ideas were always wild and wide ranging. And he's somebody that I continue to turn to. And honestly, every time I pick up his books, I find a poem that I somehow haven't read before. And I'm always consistently amazed by what's going on in them.
I guess the element that I also find really interesting about Scarborough is the kind of isolation of his life, while also, and then I guess you read the poems, and he is like a reflection of all these things that he's taking in from his period, but it's also, I don't know, him, and it is. I was wondering how much you think about, I guess, isolation away from the larger like literary world plays into, I don't know, the spark of George Scarborough, or and like I guess it is like not um the isolation of his life was also not by choice, right? Because he's both gay in the South during a time where probably not the best time to be a gay guy in the rural South, and also incredibly poor for most of his life. So it's definitely isolation by, I mean, not by choice.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, so Robert Frost, for instance, was always, for instance, he would he moved to London and then he moved back, or he moved to London and then moved outside of London, saying he wanted to be in a more rural place. And then he'd move back to the U.S. and get a college job at, say, Amherst, and then he'd go back to a farm. And he would consistently Frost would kind of play act at always wanting solitude, but he was also always on the road, always engaging with the wider literary world. And Scarborough could not do that. Scarborough would encounter the wider literary world and truly flee, like truly go back to solitude. So I think that he was uncomfortable in bigger situations. He went to let's see if I can remember exactly. He went to the University of the South for, I think, 1 year in Sewanee, maybe 2 years. He was briefly, I think, at Vanderbilt and again left, and finally did graduate from college at Lincoln Memorial University in the Cumberland Gap. But he was never able to stay in that bigger social situation. And similarly, he never lived in a city. He was a school teacher for a little bit, but again, eventually moved back to the house where his mother was and lived there, taking care of her for most of his later adult life. So so he was somebody, if maybe some of the elements of his life weren't chosen, right? Like his sexuality or the fact that he came from a very rural place. But also I think he was simultaneously had difficulty in more urban places or in bigger groups of people, but also just he had to be in that landscape. That part of East Tennessee was too much a part of his sense of self that he couldn't leave there for long. And it's interesting too that he published those first three books with Dutton, which was a pretty significant poetry press in the 40s and 50s, and then just pulled everything back. Didn't publish anything with a New York house ever again. All of his books were published. So he also published with this small press for the rest of his life. I guess a similar maybe you could find a similar example in somebody like Gwendolyn Brooks, who of course was far more famous than George Scarborough, though they honestly are about the same generation, interestingly. But Brooks, of course, stopped publishing with Harper and decided to only publish with black-owned small presses in the second part of her life. So you could say that maybe Scarborough did something similar, published with a small Appalachian press, and didn't want to be involved in the wider New York-based literary world. So it begs the question: who else is doing that right now? Who else has decided that art doesn't have to be in the accepted circles, if you know what I mean.
From that period of time, you're saying?
From that period or right now, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Cult Magazine. Uh, no, I guess it's like yeah, the finding the kind of like neglected people of the period, and then kind of I guess wondering on why they didn't engage with like the larger publishing world. I mean, it is kind of like affirming in a way that you're like, oh yeah, like it's always sucked to like do that, and it's
Yeah,
always been cooler to not do that.
absolutely. And if you're writing
Yeah.
you're writing outside the I don't know what the right word is, mainstream, zeitgeist, whatever, it always makes it harder to get attention. Scarborough was writing in meter and rhyme in the 50s, which, I mean, certainly he wasn't the only one, but that wasn't exactly what was hip. Uh, you know, um, I mean, you think about what's happening certainly at least in the period when he wasn't publishing. I mean, you've got all of the writers of the beats and all the New York school writers. That's the stuff that's getting a lot of attention. And
Yeah.
Scarborough was so far away from that it just wouldn't have made any sense for him to engage in that world.
Yeah.
Do you think that oh, well, I guess like could you like speak to sort of like how the unconventional formalism and also like the regionalism maybe would have spoke to each other? And do you think that was something he did as a sort of maybe not necessarily in like sort of abject opposition? Do you think the regionalism and sort of the unconventional formalism spoke to each other? Because I guess I'm thinking of how I don't know, like Lorene Niedeker, and sort of like the critiques at her were always you're too Wisconsin, you're too Wisconsin, and how like sort of her dissolution of form was sort of a way to engage the regionalism in a sort of experimental way. I guess do you see like I don't know the flip side of that with Scarborough, where like those formal maneuvers are actually sort of like yeah, sort of like I guess a rejection of the critical sphere or critical circle around him, maybe.
That's a good question. I think for him, poetry was always such a deeply private and intimate practice. I think that maybe he just wouldn't have cared what other people were writing. Honestly, I think that he enjoyed the way that he could make a thing with meter and rhyme. And then, in
Hmm.
particular, something that I take from Scarborough is his use of enjambment, right? He's a lot like Keats in that way, like just relentlessly using enjambment to make the meter and rhyme sound different and unexpected. So for him, I think it was just a way of making things. I think he saw himself as a kind of craftsperson. As far as the connection to the region, I think if you read these poems, you wouldn't think, "Oh, this is the rural South." There's he's not trying to ham it up like even Frost does in some of his poems. I think Scarborough would say that these people in rural Tennessee are weird and creative. Just like all people. And so I think the poems are reflective of his very unique experience living in that place, if that makes
Hmm.
sense. I could read a poem. Should we read a poem?
Oh yeah.
Absolutely.
Why don't we
Yeah.
do that?
Rip one.
Or we'll read from the first book. Let me get it. Just this isn't his best poem or my favorite, but it'll give you a good example of the kinds of things that I'm talking about, of how sort of different this poetry can be. This is a poem called On Reaching 25. And this is at the very beginning of his first book. No more recourse to resolutions of an errant nature is avenued for me. Attack by darkness, sudden fury prove nothing at all. The torrid Cherokee time has reduced to sallowness. Sedate, I wonder at myself, am most amazed in this most middle era to relate previous prismatic furies I had raised and gloried in before I took the wine of ultimate disobedience. That I fell becomes by choice the chief concern of mine, but how I trekked here I can never tell. Across the river is a crystal land, chromatic past belief. Behind the years is knowledge, but nothing chiefer than that to the east lies the trail of tears. And currently emerging into man's most curious apex of uncertain views in stunned quiescence, I behold the land's high private face and hear the latest news. Nor do the high cheekbones assemble the level leaves of fear, nor any bough of scarlet anger I cannot resemble more than I resemble anger now. When I have grown collected as a stone, with every atom placed, each fiber stayed in one small body so collected grown, little is left of what I once was made, except the high cheekbones, the russet at the crowded eye, endorsing me the same, whose body grew under the ambush that I found so early in an English name. So good. So weird,
Hell yeah.
right? It's like so I still when I read that I think this is really weird. It's even weird for now. I suppose you could say it sounds a little bit like Hart Crane if there's anyone I could think of that it reminds me of, but it's so just relentlessly unique to me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, can I ask, what do we know about Scarborough's sort of like sort of formative interests, and then also like what would he have like been reading during his more productive moments? You talked about like Heaney and like Frost, but was there anybody else that were especially formative for him?
As far as I know, there's no letters. There's no letters that have been published, and I haven't been. There is an archive of his stuff at some tiny school in Georgia. I don't know how they got his papers. It's called Reinhardt College. So I've never read his letters, so I don't know exactly what he was reading, but I know he was obviously read a lot of Frost. The fugitives were important to him. You can hear a lot of Ransom in some of these early poems. Also, Keats, of course. Dickinson is a big influence on him if we're thinking about older poets. And then certainly he was also reading the Appalachian poets of the time that maybe outside of this world people don't know. Somebody like Jesse Stewart and James Still, who was roughly a contemporary of Scarborough's. Jesse Stewart especially, who had a big book of sonnets called The Man with the Bull Tongue Plow. That would have been a pretty important influence on Scarborough, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, those things, Dickinson, Keats, Frost, I think would be his primary influences. But honestly, the thing he read the most was the dictionary. Uh, he every morning he would, especially later in his life, he would go over to his dictionary stand where he had a huge print dictionary, and he would flip through it until he found a word he didn't know. That was his day. That was one of his daily rituals, along with writing. And I think you can honestly hear
Hmm.
it in the poems, the way that very unexpected, unusual words will pop into an otherwise seemingly normal poem. You know, like in that poem I just read, where he's describing the landscape, and he says, "Across the river is a crystal land, chromatic, past belief." What is that word chromatic doing there in that poem, right?
Yeah.
Only somebody for whom vocabulary was an enormous tool bag would that word even pop into the mind as a possibility there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
I know that is such a like distinct part of reading him is like the like sometimes it has like the texture of like a like an undergrad research paper of just like spamming the thesaurus. Like not being funny here, but like there are just like crazy words that just that do pop up and do, but like chromatic past belief was really the one that stood out for me in that poem as well. It's interesting too that, that pulling the poem, I guess, that's talking about Cherokee ancestry and being, I guess, literally trapped within language himself, like, or being bound by a language that is not necessarily his in terms of ancestry, and attempting to like make something that feels correct out of himself through English, and specifically in this like weird scientific way of like opening up the dictionary and finding a new word, or jamming in words like chromatic next to like mountains and lakes. It does feel like a sort of like, I don't know, rebellious act in a way. It's, as you were saying, like he's not hamming it up as Frost would. He's not saying, "Oh, look at my dear South, look at my dear Blue Ridge Mountains."
Right.
He's trying to make the atmosphere and the space strange and like thoughtful, or like very curious.
Yeah. And he's borrowing some of that vocabulary stuff from John Crow Ransom, like I said earlier. Obviously, that was one of the sort of aesthetic ideals of the fugitives was using unusual vocabulary to sort of pull the reader out of the poem. But for me, when Scarborough does it, because he's speaking from a true rural experience, whereas Ransom by that point was a Tony professor at Vanderbilt. It feels very different to have someone who literally has grown up as a sharecropper using the broad range of English to describe these places without being, as you said, pat or ham-handed or overly romantic about it.
Yeah.
So for me, it's just, and he does it in other ways too. It's not just dictionary words. He'll also go the other direction. In one of my very favorite of his poems, towards the end of the book, after beautifully describing a sunset, he says that sundown is a flower I cannot deal with in usual ways, right? So he'll drop the diction level as well, and so he's constantly surprising the reader in that way, which I find just utterly compelling. And later in his life, in later poems, he'll be very funny as well. He has a wonderful poem about a crow where he basically just spends the whole poem making fun of the crow, and it's hysterical because he sees the animals and the landscape basically as his neighbors.
Hmm.
So why not laugh at it, I suppose he would say.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, I guess, in your own relationship to writing about your little strip of land, how you, I don't know, create that sense of, I guess you could call it alienation, or distance within the poem that both allows the reader to understand that we're talking about, I don't know, beautiful things in the country, but also it's not overly romanticized. Is that kind of similar in your thought process and in your writing?
Yeah, I guess for me, you're right. So one of the things that I take from, say, Frost, I've been bad mouthing a little bit, but I love Frost. Right, he's been deeply
And you've been
influenced.
kind of dragging Frost
Yeah,
all
well, that's because
podcast.
I've been
He's a
reading like
punk.
I'm on biography number 3, and there's a lot not to admire in the biographies. Let me tell you. Uh,
Really.
but in the poems there is an astonishing amount to admire. And one of the things that I really like about Frost is that he takes the romantic impulse, right? Which for him his touchstones were Keats and Longfellow, but he's Frost is constantly undercutting his claims. If a boy goes across the field, the boy will probably come back. Right? If a man walks down the city street, he will walk back. Frost is always saying something and then sort of taking it back. So undercutting his authority in a way. And for me, that's become really crucial. Like nothing makes me more uncomfortable in a poem than when somebody says something really earnest and then that's it. And it's sort of like it's some sort of like mic drop of knowledge and wisdom. And I'm not interested in that. Nobody, I hope, is coming to my poems for my wisdom. Uh, you
Hmm.
know, and so I borrow from Frost that sense of undercutting the voice. And for me, I think the way maybe I do that is I really like the way that like sort of filler words in English, like etc. or maybe not, or I guess so. I like working those into meter. right? So that if you're, say, writing in rhymed quatrains of iambic pentameter, you don't leave phrases out because they're just filler phrases, but instead use them to be a part of the meter. And for me, that creates that distance that you're talking about, Jake, where maybe I
Hmm.
feel where sort of I don't want the image to be, I guess now I'm sounding like Jeffrey Hill, but I don't want the image to be too beautiful, if you will, right? Because then it
Mm.
becomes a little bit like the uncanny valley, right? Like if it's
Hmm.
too beautiful, it's not believable
Yeah.
in a way. So I think
Right.
that's kind of, as I write about this place or any place, I think to get it across in its reality, you can't just write about the sunsets and the high breeze blowing through the maples. You also have to write about the squirrels falling out of the trees and the rotten things, the dead animals on the driveway. I think you have to
Hmm.
include it all.
Yeah. Yeah. Jenkins, I'm interested to hear, I guess, your take on that. I think your poetry is wildly different from Neil's, and I think there is like as a similar thing going on, and like this, you do, I guess, like Jenkins. I feel like, you can stop me if this doesn't sound correct, but I feel like you do assault the reader a little bit with like words and like near language that like kind of like through sound and like little like tidbits you do eventually create a scene or an image, but it is like through not like normal sentences in language. But I guess are you thinking about something similar when you're creating I don't know, an idea or a scene in your own poems?
Well, I'm really liking the discussion about sort of like Scarborough reflecting on sort of this rural environment, but not trying to be romantic or hammy about it. This year, I published a chapbook. Really, I mean, it was inspired pretty much directly by my eighth grade basketball season in rural Iowa. But like the whole like the gist of the project was I was sort of critiquing. Well, when I'm critiquing like Iowa as sort of like and really a good chunk of the Midwest is sort of like a post-apocalyptic type of state. Like, and Iowa specifically, like, you know, over 99% of the original ecology was like totally destroyed to produce like this massive amount of farmland. And, and I do a lot of word gamey type stuff and a lot of sort of neologisms and all that. And it's very sort of like language poetry inspired. But I think I'm doing it for the sake of sort of like estranging this sort of like romantic image of the Midwest. There's so much very like, Midwestern is like this beautiful sort of like, we go out here to be in solitude. I mean, it's very much, I guess it's akin to the Frosty and stuff. I don't know. I'm thinking of like Ted Kooser and like this sort of like, the Midwest is this like very friendly, beautiful, solicitude space. And yeah, and I'm very skeptical of that. I have my political qualms with that. And I guess like this is why I'm interested in Scarborough even more so now is that sort of I guess feeling very connected to a space because I definitely feel very connected to Iowa. Like I lived there for 25 years, um, but also I don't know, wanting to create a little bit of distance with the art too. Yeah, I don't know, I think that's going about it in different ways, of course, but I think there's a similar thing going on there fundamentally too, with
Yeah.
wanting to just sort of like I don't know, throw some mist at the space. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I did want to ask about kind of, or I guess return to sort of the language of the land and how you feel like Scarborough is like not only channeling, I guess, the like image of his land, but also the like the way people sound there. And then because we published a few poems by Neil in an issue. I don't remember which issue it was. It was the second issue that we ran last year.
Yeah.
Um, and there is like kind of like the filler words that are thrown in there. There's also like like stuff like drive through windows and uh and I guess I'm interested in like what Jenkins talking about is like how do you write about the South nowadays where it is I feel like it's hard to like even the old charm of it seems pretty gone like and how do you but how do you make that into poetry, and how do you make the dumb crassness of the like surrounding rural Virginians, and not to say that not to say that it's all like slack-jaw provincial country people, but there is, there's some tough kids out there in Virginia, as I think Neil referred to them before. And I guess I'm wondering about incorporating like the real kind of like essence of like that type of language and that type of person and that type of voice that does exist around you into your poetry, because or do you ignore it? I don't know how, because there's a lot of times when I write about the South or like write about just like contemporary life, and it does just seem like almost too dumb to like write about.
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that was Frost's project, right? Especially with the second book, North of Boston, that made him famous, where he was trying to get the sound of how people talked in rural New England into his poems. And he's very successful at that. That's not what Scarborough is doing, really. Scarborough writes a lot about people, but he doesn't. I would say he's not interested in working out in working in that like an East Tennessee accent into the poems or anything like that.
Hmm.
So he, I think, like me, maybe would resist that attempt. Mostly because if you've ever written fiction, and I think maybe Jake, you're the only one among us, you know that writing dialogue is really hard. So if you're not good at
Yeah.
it, you better stay away from it.
Yeah.
But for me, yeah, I guess I don't. I don't write too much about people that I know here, but part of that is I really don't know a lot of people here, honestly.
Hmm.
One thing about rural America is that with the post Reagan, we've hollowed out small towns. I mean, entirely.
Hmm.
And so there is, once upon a time, probably Cumberland would have been a much more happening place with a little grocery store, a couple little restaurants, little hardware store. But after Reagan, all that went away, right? And so
Hmm.
there are no, like, small towns don't have grocery stores anymore. In fact, I was just reading an article about why that is. And of course, it was, in fact, Reagan's fault, as you might have predicted. Uh, but
Yeah.
and I'm sure the same thing has played out in the Midwest, right? Where there's ghost town after ghost town, and you got to drive 50 minutes
Yeah.
to get to a grocery store. Well, it didn't used to be like that, right? It certainly wasn't like
Yeah.
that when Robert Frost was writing. There would have been a grocery store in his tiny little town near his farm, and that would have been true for Scarborough too. And so when there's not a grocery store in your little town, you don't meet the people that live near you. Right?
Yeah.
That's just how it is. So I've lived here for 17 years, and most people still don't even know who I am. Right? I'm still
Yeah.
still like the new guy. Uh, but so I do write about my neighbor Lee, who I know very well. He's a persistent presence in my first book, and then has popped up in poems here and there, and in the book of essays from last summer. And so I guess maybe unbeknownst to him, or a little bit beknownst to him, I use him as a kind of stand-in for all the people here. And in that way, they come off well because Lee is a very dear, smart, thoughtful person. And so I like to
Hmm.
believe most people are thoughtful and dear if given a chance. The problem is they're often not given a chance. Uh,
Yeah.
but that's a good
Yeah.
question. Yeah. So like, I don't know if I could actually convey what it's like to live here in poems. So I just kind of use a fictional version of the place in a way.
Right.
And
Yeah.
actually, in my newer poems, the ones that I think we're in Colt, are even more fictional. They're kind of like weird versions of the Psalms, where
Yeah.
I'm imagining the speaker kind of exiled in a place a little bit like this,
Yeah.
but more fictional.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you also, I guess, moving on from, I guess, the actual language of it to the simple act of collecting. I guess, to my knowledge, you're one of the few, or one of the top collectors of Scarborough's work. Would you say that?
Probably, I got scared that it was all just gonna disappear, like that used bookstores would just throw the books away because
Yeah.
nobody knew who he was. So over a period of like 5 6 years, I pretty much tried to buy any copy that came up for sale, uh,
Yeah.
especially of the older editions of his books. There are still some on ABE books. They're a good bit more expensive now. So word has gotten out a little bit, partially thanks to me, I hope. But
Yeah.
But yeah, so I have four copies of his first book, two first printings, two second printings. I have four copies of the second book, which I haven't seen a copy of that in years. I have one copy of the third book, which is the rarest by far. I think many of the print run of this book was destroyed by accident.
Wow.
Many were just lost, but I couldn't find this book for years. And then I finally found a copy online. It's the only time I've ever seen it for sale anywhere.
Yeah.
And I bought it. And I also have a bunch of his signed stuff. Um, and partially this was before there was any archive. There, like I said, there is now a repository of his papers and things. So I do feel like it's at least protected in some ways. But
Yeah.
honestly, in addition to being a fan, I was just scared that some of it would disappear.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I
So,
did what I could. I did what I could to
yeah.
keep it from disappearing.
Yeah.
Not that anyone but me has access to it in my house, but still.
Yeah, I guess I mean that's like the other part, right? Is like it's in a way it still has disappeared. It's all in one place. Like I mean, do you feel like compelled to like share or like I don't know, create the Scar well, I guess there is the Scarborough library at the tiny Georgia school, but
Yeah.
as someone that has put a lot of effort into like collecting the works and like protecting the works from going out of print, like do you feel compelled to like get it out there as much as possible, or is it different? It's just kind of like knowing that it's not gone and you have it.
I mean, I do talk about him all the time.
Yeah, and you teach them too,
I try to write about anytime I have an opportunity to write about a poet. I usually will choose George Scarborough.
Yeah.
I had an essay on him in my book of essays, and so I do try to talk about him. And he is. It's not like he's unknown. I mean, in Appalachian literary circles, he's certainly well known. Uh,
Yeah.
but that's a pretty small circle. If you know anyone in Appalachian studies, they all know each other. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are a few people who do work on Scarborough. There was a small essay on him with some unpublished poems in 5 Points a few years ago, and I ran a poem of his in the Hampton City Poetry Review a few years ago, which had been published in a magazine but had never been collected in a book. But I would do more. I would publish anything anybody would let me publish, honestly.
Yeah.
So as far as my collection goes, that's just something I have enjoyed amassing, and I suppose one day I'll give it to somebody, but not right now.
I did want to I guess I wanted to talk about the idea of ancestry as well. And this is sort of I mean, I'm thinking of it because of the Scarborough poem we read that brought up ancestry. But uh, I guess Neil, you're from Indiana originally, is that right?
Well, no, I'm from Atlanta.
You're from Atlanta. Okay, Georgia to you've been all over though, I guess.
Georgia to I
Uh,
went to college in North Carolina, and then lived in Rhode Island for a little while my wife was in grad school.
yeah.
Then
Yeah.
we lived in London for a year, and then Indiana, and then here.
I guess in and as you move around, do you find yourself like, is there a central bone to pick that you feel like goes back to, I don't know, Atlanta, or is it now kind of rest in your home in Virginia? Like, is there something like more than the immediate place that you've kind of been carrying around, or has it left? I think like I don't know. I guess I wonder about that in terms of like writers and the like things that like haunt them a little bit. I feel like in some ways like that is talking about like the idea of like what like compels you to write. Like I don't know, for some people maybe it's just fun and other people it's scholarly and interesting, but I do think like for myself and for people that I find interesting, I do kind of like sense like there's a I don't know, like something that's haunting that you're trying to figure out, that there's something like in the I don't know, wilderness of the self that that you try to trace back as far as you can, and it typically gets you back to your early days.
Yeah, that's a good. I mean, weirdly, while Scarborough wrote about his childhood consistently through his whole career, um,
Yeah.
I have never once written anything about my childhood, and It's not that it wasn't good, and I mean, or anything, but it's just not compelling to me. Maybe my parents did a great job, and I have no complaints. I don't know, but I've never written anything about being a kid in Atlanta or anything at all. So yeah, so if I have a bone to pick, it doesn't come from them, which is maybe a little weird to think about. But I think if I have a central concern, I guess it would be just my general insufficiency
Yeah.
as a human, or
Yeah.
especially once I had kids as a parent.
Yeah.
Just like the way that we constantly, daily, don't live up to our tasks, which is maybe the thing that makes us human in a way. I think that's maybe the thing that I find myself writing about the most. This sort of the ways in which we fail, but nevertheless keep trying. Maybe that sounds cheesy. I don't mean it to. It's just sort of how I go through my day, right? Like at the end of the day, you're like, okay, I fucked up here. I shouldn't have said that thing. I forgot to do this thing, right? And then the next day, we start over, right?
Yeah.
By all accounts, we should really quit doing most of the things that we do, but we don't. And maybe for most people, for many people, their childhood provides that like that place where everything got messed up, but
Hmm.
that's not the case for me. uh
Yeah.
I don't know, Jenkins, what do you think? Do you write about your childhood?
Yeah, I kind of a decent amount. But it's not. I don't know. I guess for me, it's like more like sort of like early teens is like kind of the start of it. I don't know. Maybe that's like the genesis of like me forming an adulthood. Maybe that's where my bone to pick actually comes in because I don't really talk about like childhood. It's always like if I go back to youngness, it's always sort of like I feel like around 13. I'll have to think about that more. That's interesting. Um, and it's always I feel like if I'm thinking about sort of my youthfulness, it's always sort of like in relate like I do like writing sort of like sportsy poems. That's definitely come up a lot in the past couple of years. But when I'm talking about sort of youth and sports, it's always sort of like masculinity and problems I have with masculinity as a whole. So maybe it's not even necessarily like maybe the age is coincidental and I'm really talking about sort of this larger overarching thing.
Hmm. Well, that's a perfect segue, Jankin. I guess the idea of masculinity does exist in the works of Scarborough, you'd say, Neil, right?
Oh yeah.
Um, and I did want to ask you, I guess, how you think that manifests. I mean, there's poems. I'm looking at one right now. It's called "I Have a Lonely Heart," where it's quite obvious what we're talking about. But he is also, I mean, his right, he's not you we were talking about this before the podcast, is like he wasn't openly gay, and I don't know if did he have a partner throughout his life, and
No.
he's kind of alone, and more than anything alone, right? And that seems to be like exists throughout his poems, is this like deep lonesomeness or deep isolation.
Yeah, I'm not sure he was lonely, but yes, he was alone.
Yeah.
He certainly lived
Yeah.
in solitude. My second book is about has does a lot of thinking about monasticism, and I was thinking about Scarborough a lot while I was working on that book, thinking about solitude and community. And for Scarborough, I mean, there wasn't much community outside of his writing. I guess you could say he created his own community, but he surely lived in solitude, right? For him, I think it was a rich one and a rewarding solitude, which is not true for all for all people who attempt that. As far as I know, he had no sustained romantic relationship at all. He wrote about a few sexual encounters in that he had as a child, right? As maybe like a preteen, and these were those are mostly in the first book, and those were very formative experiences for him.
Hmm.
But as far as I know, I don't know what relationships he ever had as an adult, but certainly nothing sustained. So there was a kind of true solitude there, right? Um, which comes across in the poems. He will write about lovers from time to time, but their identity is always masked by a nickname, and it's never clear if they're real or invented. There's a beautiful sequence in the second book called Poems for Midi, and the Midi is a lover figure. And here I'll just read one sonnet from the end of that. This is an incredible sonnet. I love this. This is section 7 of that poem. This morning I will climb into the timber and freeze my body till the cold is all my nerves will care to recognize and remember. There in the cold my heart will beat so small the pain will vanish, and the sleepless night that stood above me with a locust cry will not return. For where the air is right, the heart puts on the cold cap of the sky. I will go up till every feeling fall inert in ice and every thought is turned against the wind. Survival will be all I care about. And where before was burned the fine familiar aspects of a face, only the clarity of a dangerous place. Woo, so good. I love that poem. Right, so there he's thinking of a lover, and actually in that poem, which is interesting, the lover figure sometimes seems female and sometimes seems male, which and he does write about eunuchs at other times. So maybe for Scarbrough, even just gender itself was very forward thinkingly fluid in his mind,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Even as he thought of himself in a way. But whether that led to loneliness or not, I'm not sure. I don't think we have. I have not read enough of his private correspondences. Or there is a small book of interviews with Scarbrough, though it's been a while since I read it. But
Yeah.
he still keeps things pretty tight to the chest, even in those interviews, if I remember.
Yeah. Which maybe, I don't know, I guess, yeah. Talking about Scarborough and his, like, you were mentioning he truly fled away from anything that, like, resembled a, like, literary life. I think, that's part of the deal. I think, like, the way you make it is you do kind of have to, like, hustle and, like, put your, like, self out there, right?
Yeah,
And,
I mean, I feel that way honestly. Like as much as I would love to have more people read my poems, the idea of like hustling on Instagram just makes me want to stick my head in a hole and never come out.
yeah, yeah, which has been, which is, I guess in my own pursuits, it has been an interesting part of running this magazine because, like, prior to doing this is like I didn't want to do any of that shit and like I was really trying to like not use Instagram or like not do anything and now it's like now it's like it's not just me that I'm like not putting out there. It's like now I'm like fucking over others if I don't go hard promoting.
Right, right.
So
No,
yeah.
I think honestly, Jake, I think you could say that my approach is naive and misguided, right? I mean, I think there is value to promoting your work and engaging in the systems of literary production and distribution. And one could certainly criticize Scarborough for backing away from all of that. I think it's very easy to romanticize that move, right? To look at Emily Dickinson and say like, "Oh wow, she was a recluse," which she actually really wasn't, right? Or like, but like that's not an idea. That's not a way to live, right? To back out of all systems
Yeah.
and communities. I think the thing is, just be careful of how you operate it. Like how much are
Yeah.
you doing? At what point are you doing good literary community work, and at what point are you just hustling, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is the conversation between regionalism like now is like so much poetry stuff is like done through Instagram. I feel like Instagram has superseded all other forms of social media when it comes to actually,
Yeah,
you know, talking about poetry. And it's kind of the point where like I feel like sort of like regional affiliation is like totally not totally, but it's definitely like not really at the forefront of people's minds. I mean, I can't say even in early in the 20th century it was like a super popular thing to be associated with, but like now it's like I feel like where you come from. Yeah, I mean, people are just moving constantly, and like with mass communication, it's so easier to talk to people. Like, yeah, the sort of the regional valence, I feel, definitely goes off into the ether.
right. There's a kind of placelessness in ways. I
Yeah.
think that's right. it's interesting. When Frost or when Scarborough was born, 1915. That's at the tail end of the regionalist literature, right? Which was with like Mark Twain, Sarah Orne Jewett, even Frost to some extent, right? Because what was happening was now that books and print could be disseminated cheaply and easily, people were interested in reading about these far-flung parts of the United States. So in a way, like, it's kind of too bad that the internet hasn't been the same, right? That we see it as a way of learning about other places and communities. Instead, somehow we envision the internet as a place,
Yeah.
right? Which is weird. So, like, I dabble on Blue Sky and used to be on Twitter, and I think it's really weird how they refer to those apps as places. And somebody smarter than me could write about this, but like, I'm like, it's not a place. Like, we're all in a place. It kind of removes real regions and creates. I mean, I could imagine an anthology in the future, like Poets of Blue Sky, right? That's their place, right? So does that
Yeah,
is that a
yeah.
is or Instagram? Is Instagram a place? Is it a city? I don't know.
That's the Bougiard point, right? The simulacrum, that the thing is not simulation for something else. The thing is the thing that we're looking at. Yeah, it's become its own autonomous place. Um, yeah, it's definitely interesting to like engage with it now because I mean, I guess in terms of like the desire to write or make stuff, there is this maybe like naive or like childish view that like you have something unique going on, and you frankly do. Everyone has a unique brain that has its own experiences, but you do. How do you make yourself feel like an individual when like these like ideas of place have kind of faded, both like outwardly first, like you, I mean, Jankin, product of Midwest strip malls, that the end of land, and now like in your own mind, like we've lost the sense of being anywhere, of like or knowing what being somewhere is, and can now will now refer to that as for anything. I'm at the Instagram spot, which is not a place at all, or it is because in our heads it's how it works. It's not we're not actually, maybe all along like we haven't actually like cared about place, but it's really been this other idea going on, which is interesting, I guess, in relation to Scarborough too, because you know, isn't his little, I mean, at least in Teleco Blue we're talking about kind of an imagined place. These even has like a name for it, uh Eastonel, right? And
Right,
it's this, you do kind of feel like you're stepping into like a fictionalized zone. And you could say he's a regional poet, but he's not exactly a regional poet. He's kind of creating like a fiction that is his world, and that's what's so appealing, and that's why it's like indescribable, because you don't have the typical terms, because you can't say, well, he's Appalachian kind of, or he's Native American. It's no, he's George Scarborough. It's Scarborough-esque.
right.
Yeah. I did want to, I guess, conclude with um, that essay that you, I mean, talking about that essay that you wrote about, is it Scarborough? I believe is it, we were the God of self-love. Is that the same essay? Do you
No,
remember this from your book of essays?
that's the one on Jeffrey Hill. I would say they both have similar interests, right? That
Yeah,
Hill is deeply invested in what it means to be English, right? And whether one can even be English while still reckoning with England's past, right?
yeah,
And so, like, kind of the more philosophical, I guess, sense of what it means to be from and in a place. And
hmm,
Scarborough in some ways is similar in that, how to represent a place fully, fairly, right? And so in that ways, maybe Hill and Scarborough are kind of similar, though they had very different lives,
yeah,
right? I mean, Hill was a professor at Cambridge, and Scarborough was living in his mom's house in East Tennessee.
yeah. It's all the same.
It's all the same.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. All right. Let's see. Um, Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Jankin. They all got Thanks. I thought it was a good that was a good podcast. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun.
Yeah. Um, Hopefully this inspires someone to read Scarborough and also to read you guys. Jenkins has a chapbook out called what?
Sixth Man Award. Sixth Man Award.
6-1 Award, and that's through Cut Press. And what were you saying? You can just DM Jenkins if you want a copy
Yeah,
of it.
honestly, just reach out to me through what I've got a link tree. If you, I'm pretty sure I'm the only person on earth named Jenkins Benson. So if you Google me,
Yeah.
you'll find me.
I love it.
And then Neil has a book that came out in July called something like Joy but Darker.
Joy,
Is that
joy,
right?
joy, or something darker but like it.
Yeah. And we also did an interview about that when it was about to come out, which you can read on our website. And is that available to the public or only to the very special people?
No. You can get it on any book selling platform.
Okay. Everyone buy Neil's book. He needs to buy more chicken feed.
That is always true.
Yeah. I really appreciate it, guys. Hope you had a good time. Enjoy your grading, Jenkins. Neil, enjoy farming. I don't know what
I've
you're
also
doing today.
got grading. I'm just less responsible than Jenkins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. I appreciate it, guys.
Okay.
All right.
Good to see you, Jake. Good to meet you, Jenkins.